I have been a creature of habit for most of my adult life. 31 years of the same morning commute through Aldermere Central, the 7:14, Platform 2, always the second carriage from the front, and 31 years of the same return, the 6:48, a newspaper folded to the crossword, and a nod to whoever was on the barrier. For much of that time, the man on the barrier was Edwin Moss. You notice things, over 31 years. I noticed that Edwin was never in a hurry, even when the platform was heaving. I noticed that he called the regulars by name, not obsequiously, not the way a man does when he wants something, but the way a man does when he has simply paid attention. I noticed the way he would stand for a moment after a train had gone, watching the last of the exhaust thin out above the platform canopy, the way a person watches something they have seen 10,000 times and still find worth watching. When Edwin retired, in the autumn of 2 years ago, the depot staff put on a small evening at the station itself. The old first-class waiting room had been restored some years back, the chandeliers rehung, the mahogany paneling oiled and darkened, the plasterwork touched up, and it was used occasionally for civic evenings. The Aldermere Railway Heritage Trust, of which I am a committee member, had arranged a charity concert to mark the occasion. 40 or 50 guests, a light supper, and Dorian Fell. I should explain who Dorian Fell was, for those who weren't there. He was, at that time, one of the more celebrated chamber pianists on the regional circuit, a tall man in his early 50s, well dressed in the way that signals long practice rather than recent acquisition, with a carrying voice he used often. He had agreed to perform as a favor to the Heritage Trust, which had helped restore the waiting room's Broadwood upright, a handsome instrument, older than most of the guests, tuned that afternoon by a man who drove down from Carlisle specially. Fell was the kind of man who understood the value of his own attendance, and made sure those around him understood it too. I arrived a little early, as I always do. The room was not yet full, and the staff were still arranging the last of the chairs. Edwin was among them, though he had technically retired 3 weeks before. He had come in because, as Mrs. Hadley from ticketing told me later, he had offered to help and nobody had thought to say no. He was moving chairs with the unhurried precision of 38 years, each one set at the same angle to its neighbor, each row dressed as carefully as if it were the morning shift. He was wearing a dark jacket I had not seen before, a little large across the shoulders, and his hair was combed. I watched him for a moment before he saw me. He paused once, halfway through resetting a row, and his eyes went to the Broadwood against the far wall. Just a glance. Then he went back to the chairs. The evening filled up around 7. Dorian Fell arrived with a companion, a woman I took to be a fellow musician, from the way they spoke, and promptly occupied the center of the room's attention. He was good at that. He moved through the gathered guests with the particular ease of a man who has never had cause to doubt that a room wishes him well, shaking hands, inclining his head at introductions, laughing at things he had not quite heard. Edwin, by this point, had finished the chairs and was standing near the Broadwood, straightening some sheet music on a side table that the organizer had left there. He was not playing it. He was simply tidying it, the way he would have tidied anything in the station that had gone slightly out of place. I saw Fell notice him, a quick glance, the slightly narrowed appraisal of a man accustomed to reading rooms and assigning everyone in them to a category. I was standing close enough to hear what followed. Fell said it to the room, not to Edwin, that was the telling thing. He raised his voice just slightly, the way a man does when he is performing for an audience rather than addressing a person. "Since you seem so fond of the instrument," he said, with a gesture that managed to be both expansive and dismissive, "perhaps you'd like to play us something to warm the room up." There was a ripple of polite amusement. A few of the guests looked at Edwin. A few looked at Fell. Edwin looked at the piano. Fell turned back to his companion and said, in a voice he did not lower quite enough, "He'll never keep up." His companion smiled. I felt something move in my chest, not anger exactly, but something quieter and colder. Edwin looked up from the piano. He did not look at Fell. He looked at the Broadwood for another moment, the way he had looked at that departing train earlier, with the patience of a man deciding something he has already decided. Then he walked to the bench and sat down. The room's attention was divided. Most people were still talking. A few were watching with the mild, expectant look of those who anticipate awkwardness and have already prepared a kind expression to wear through it. Fell's back was half turned. Edwin reached under the bench with one hand and turned the height knob once. Not twice, not 3 times. Once, without looking, which meant he had done it before and knew exactly where the seat needed to be. He placed his hands in his lap. Then he began. I have never learned to read music. I have never taken a lesson, never played any instrument beyond a childhood term of blocked recorders, never thought of myself as a person to whom music speaks in any particular way. I am a man who spent 31 years in the Department for Transport and 11 years before that in local government. I read schedules and reports. I count things. What I can tell you is that the first note stopped me mid-sip. I have tried, since that evening, to describe what it sounded like, and I cannot do it justice. I know now that the piece was Chopin, a nocturne, the men at the ticket office told me afterward. When I asked, he had to look it up on his telephone, but I did not know it then. What I knew was that something had changed in the room, the way the quality of light changes when a cloud passes from the sun, not suddenly but completely. One moment there had been 40 or 50 people talking, glasses chinking, a faint smell of cold air from the platform outside. And then there was the first note, and then a second, and by the third or fourth, the conversations nearest the piano had died. It moved outward from the instrument like a thing with weight. I watched it happen, a table of 4 to my left, 2 women who had been comparing something on a telephone screen. They looked up at the same moment, not at each other, both at Edwin. A man near the door with a glass in his hand simply stopped moving and stood. Mrs. Hadley from ticketing, who had organized the entire evening and had spent the last half hour in the particular controlled anxiety of a woman holding many things at once, went entirely still, her clipboard lowered. Edwin did not look at the room. His eyes were half closed, his back straight, and his hands moved across the keys the way water finds a course it has always known. There was nothing showy in it. No visible effort, no performance of effort. He simply played, and the piano answered, and the sound that came from that old Broadwood upright, that instrument older than most of us, tuned that afternoon by a man from Carlisle, filled the room with something I did not have a word for. I looked at Dorian Fell. He had turned at some point, I am not sure when. He was standing very still, his wine glass held at a slight angle he did not seem to notice, and he was watching Edwin with an expression I cannot claim to have expected. Not embarrassment. Not dismissal. Something more interior than either. The particular look of a man who has misread a room and knows it, and is recalibrating in silence. His companion had her hand on his arm. Neither of them spoke. The music moved through the room. There were passages of great stillness in it, and then a swelling that rose without announcement and left you briefly airless, and then a settling back into something that felt, improbably, like peace. I am not using these words because they are the right musical terms. I am using them because they are what I felt, and I am a man who counts things and tries to be accurate. The woman 2 rows in front of me was weeping. Not dramatically. She had her hands in her lap and her eyes were bright and full, and she did not wipe them, perhaps because to do so would have meant acknowledging that she was weeping in a railway waiting room, which is not the kind of thing a person expects to do on a Thursday evening in November. I found I did not trust my own face entirely. I looked at the chandelier. After a moment, I looked back. The station master, a young man named Carew, who had started 18 months before Edwin retired, and who would not have known Edwin when Edwin was in the full flood of the job, had appeared in the doorway from the platform. He was holding his cap in both hands, and he stood there for the rest of the piece without moving. The final notes came the way the tide comes, not all at once, but incrementally, each wave a little less, until the last note was held for a long moment and then released, and the sound thinned and was gone, and there was nothing left but the quiet. The room did not applaud immediately. That was what I remember most clearly. The silence before the applause, which lasted perhaps 5 or 6 seconds, but felt longer than that. It was not an empty silence. It was the silence of a room that has received something and has not yet found a way to respond to it. I have sat in many meetings in my life, in many rooms, and I know the texture of silence fairly well. I had not sat in a silence like that before. Then Mrs. Hadley began to clap, and the rest of us followed, and within a few seconds most of the room was on its feet. I stood. The woman who had been weeping stood. The station master in the doorway stood. Dorian Fell was the last. He set his wine glass down, slowly, on the nearest surface, and he stood, and he clapped, and I could not see his face clearly from where I was, but I can tell you that the angle of his shoulders was not the angle of a man who has confirmed something he already knew. It was the angle of a man who has learned something he had not intended to learn, and is still deciding what to do with it. Edwin turned on the bench. He did not stand. He looked at the room for a moment, all those people on their feet, and then he looked down at his hands, which were resting in his lap again. A small nod, precise and contained, the sort of nod that thanks a room without claiming more from it than is offered. I made my way over to him when the applause had settled and the room had broken back into movement. I asked him where he had learned. He was quiet for a moment. He said it was something he had picked up over the years. I waited. He said, and I want to be precise here, because I have thought about these 3 sentences many times since, that 41 years ago, when he was a young man of about 27, he had missed a train at a station in the north. He had waited on the platform for the next one, and through an open window above the platform, from some upper room he could not see, someone had been playing. He did not know what it was at the time. He simply stood there in the cold and listened until the train came. By the time he got home, he said, he knew he was going to learn it. It took him a long time. But he learned it. I asked if he had played it for anyone before. He said he hadn't, no. I walked home from Aldermere Central that evening along a route I have taken hundreds of times, and it looked the same as it always does, and I noticed it in a way I do not always notice it, the particular quality of the lamplight on the wet pavement, the sound the last train makes as it clears the junction half a mile from the station. There are things you have walked past for years, I thought, that you have not yet heard. You simply need someone to play them. Edwin Moss moved to Northumberland the following spring, to be near his daughter. I do not know if he has played the piece for anyone since. I expect he probably hasn't. But I know that he played it once, in a waiting room at Aldermere Central on a Thursday evening in November, to a room that did not know what to expect from him, and that none of us who were there have quite gone back to how we heard things before. That seems, to me, to be enough.